Hi there, BookTube. It's Ros, the Scully Journaling about the books.
And Tilly from Tilly Shell.
And it's Jane Austen July.
The best time of year. It's our favourite reading event, I think.
Yeah,
One of our many favourites.
And Victober. But we have a tradition that we always make a video or two together during Jane Austen July. And the one the thing we're going to do today is talk about an aspect of Jane Austen that particularly precious to me, I would say, and that's her humour.
Yes.
And I think, people often like home in on her, romantic plot lines or whatever, but actually they're almost like, well, her quality as a writer. I mean, there's so many, her original, so many things. But one of the abiding kind of things about Austen for me is that she really is one of our greatest comic writers, I think.
Absolutely. I think it's the part of her writing that endures the best. Ideas about romance do change. There are some relationships now that we think, the age difference is a bit big or they're quite closely related or whatever. But a lot of ideas about humour sort of stay the same. And I do feel that because of the way that Jane Austen structures her humour, we've all been in these situations where we've been in social events where we might have been judging the people around us or questioning their motives, and the way that she's able to distill that into her comic writing just still really rings true.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I enjoy about her humor is that she's never really doing it just for laughs. There's always a bit more to it. It's always about revealing a character or revealing someone's motives, or it's dropping something in that actually is going to emerge in the plot later, and you'll think back to that, or it's sort of social satire, social commentary. There's always like an extra layer going on in her humor.
Yeah, she very much uses humor as a tool to reveal things about about her plots and characters and her world.
Yes, yeah. I think things that lines and scenes aren't just funny for funny's sake. They're very funny, but that's not the. I think we possibly, of all her novels, the one that is most sort of obviously written to be funny is Northanger Abbey.
Yes, in that it's written as a satire of Gothic novels, so it's written with this intent already to be undermining an entire genre.
Yes,
I suppose the humour is lost on us as a modern audience to a certain extent, because unless you have gone down that route of reading some of the Gothic fiction that she's mocking, you see less of that comedy. But then there's this, the fantastic scene that really summarizes that for me is when Henry Tilney is telling this false Gothic story about Northanger Abbey to Catherine Morland when they're driving towards arriving there.
Yes. Yeah, and it is actually, it's packed with brilliant bits of comic dialogue, and the Catherine's naivety as a character is sort of a recurring source of humor, and but a sort of a good-hearted naivety that she will see people being mean or suspect, and she'll just keep seeing the good in people, or
yeah, in many ways I see it as being perhaps one of the most comic books, but in a much more light-hearted way. Because you get all of this kind of witty, almost bantering conversation between Tilney and Catherine, and you get, like you say, the kind of the social situation jokes about Catherine's naivety, where we're almost like, we're cringing for her, we're laughing at her a little bit, we're laughing with her as she realizes her mistakes, but it's not, I suppose, the depth of humor as some of the later novels do in terms of the commentary. It's not quite there so much.
I was just thinking that we didn't say at the beginning of this, but I will say now, we will try to avoid absolute out and out spoilers, but we're sort of assuming that people are vaguely familiar with the plots of the novel. So, you know, this is not
certainly some of the comic points we want to draw on come from later on
in some of the novels. So, you know, you're forewarned now, but it's not, you know, we won't give everything away. But sometimes in Northanger Abbey, we do get that thing where you get a slightly darker point from the humour. But a favourite scene of mine in the book is when John Thorpe is kind of attempting to propose to Catherine and completely mucking it up. And she because she's just not getting what he's talking about. He says, "Oh, a famous good thing, this marrying scheme, upon my soul. Ooh, a clever fancy of Morlands and Bells. What do you think of it, Miss Morland?" I say it's no bad notion. And she says, "I'm sure I think it's a very good one." "Do you? Oh, by heavens, you know, I'm glad you're no enemy to matrimony." And so it goes on. And he thinks she understands that he's suggesting that they should get married. And he says something about, you know, oh, you know, there's a traditionally, you know, one marriage leads to another, and so, you know, and she's just
all
not
of these
getting
hints that she doesn't pick up on
any of that. But when we get the scene like a couple of chapters later, where John Thorpe's sister Isabel sort of is saying to Catherine, "Oh, you know, more or less, I understand you. We're going to be sisters-in-law. You're engaged now, you know," and Catherine genuinely didn't have a clue, and that's actually quite, there's a frisson of risk there for a young woman, you know.
Particularly when so much hangs on people's reputation and their like it's like they want them to be innocent, but at the same time you need to be a little bit less innocent than Catherine in order to be able to sort of function
operate in society. One of the recurring ways that humour happens, and is often key to Austen's plot lines as well, are those misunderstandings or people talking at cross purposes.
Yes.
I know you're
I've been listening to Sense and Sensibility and really enjoying it because it is really very funny in places. And I've just listened to the scene where there's a scene where Mrs. Jennings, there's a lot of overhearing in Sense and Sensibility, and there's a scene towards the end where Mrs. Jennings thinks she overhears Colonel Brandon proposing to Eleanor Dashwood, and she hears little snippets and puts it together in her mind to be absolutely sure that it's a proposal. And this misunderstanding goes on for quite some time. Like, she goes out and she comes back and she still believes it, and she's saying all these random things, and Eleanor's not quite understanding why she's referring to, you know, like different aspects. And it's actually, in terms of humor, it's quite trivial because it doesn't have any sort of plot impact, as in, although some of the misunderstandings do, which I think we'll come on to. But it's just really beautifully choreographed the way that misunderstanding can kind of unfold, and it just keeps us as readers kind of giggling with the foreknowledge that we have of where it's all going to go.
And that's always a fun thing as a reader, to sort of know more than the characters do, as it were, which we get a fair bit in Emma, don't we?
Yes.
And like there are many brilliant comic moments in Emma, and you know, but that cross purposes misunderstanding thing, a moment when it's very funny, but also more, you know, in a way more worrying, is when more serious, is when, like, Emma convinces herself that Harriet is in love with Frank Churchill, when actually she's in love with someone else more important to Emma. And Emma sort of says, "Oh, we understand each other. We won't mention any names, you know." And you're thinking, ah.
And they decide to play the pronoun game, as we would call it now. And as readers, you're like, you can see Emma's point of view, but you also have this kind of like little edge of doubt. Like, why not just be absolutely sure on this? And it does have that is a misunderstanding that does really have a plot impact, sort of, consequentially.
Emma is one of the books that has oodles of humor in it. It's one of the books that you know absolutely is sort of guaranteed to make me laugh in places. It has in Emma's Father, it has one of Austen's sort of classic comic characters, but in common with some of her others that we might mention, when she does those characters who can be played for laughs, that seem very ridiculous, there's always also a kind of a more poignant element to those characters. So he's a hypochondriac, you know, but he's genuinely, you know, dearly loves Emma, and his concern for other people, you know, and their health, and oh, you must use my doctor, and you mustn't do this, and you mustn't go out and be, you know, but there's a lot of love in it as well. Yeah.
And it's the same with Mrs. Bennet, for instance. She's a very comic character, and her obsession with matrimony and her daughters marrying well is played for laughs. But you know, you have to understand the huge risk that they're all under of if they don't manage to marry at least reasonably, they're all effectively going to be destitute. So it's like she's undermining that character at the same time as kind of showing us that character is in the right. Maybe going about it the wrong way, but
yes. It's one of the ways that one of the things that she does with humor is reveal a character's true colors, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm reading Mansfield Park at the moment. I can think of a couple of scenes from that which are both very funny, but really, really do that. And I think you might have one from Sense and Sensibility, but I'm going to give you one from Mansfield Park, which is when they go on an outing to Sotherham, which is and it's a brilliant bit of the book, possibly my favorite bit of the book, because all the characters go off and have these encounters, and lots of it happens in the wilderness, which is like kind of a wood, you know, and there's a lot of sort of very intense emotional stuff and symbolic stuff going on in this chapter. But how it ends is with Mrs. Norris, and Mrs. Norris having had you know, there's been all this drama going on, and she's had this really lovely day, like persuading people to give her things. She's made friends with the gardener, and she's made friends with the housekeeper, and yes, they'd been met by the gardener, with whom she'd made a most satisfactory acquaintance, for she'd set him right as to his grandson's illness, convinced him it was an ague, and promised him a charm for it, and he in return shown her all his choicest nursery plants, and actually presented her with a very curious specimen of heath, that kind of heather, you know. And by the time she goes home, she's got the heather, she's got cream cheese from the housekeeper, she's got 4 pheasants' eggs, you know. But like she's also thrilled with this stuff. She's had this great day. But what she says to Fanny is, well, this has been a fine day for you, upon my word, said Mrs. Norris as they drove through the park. Nothing but pleasure from beginning to end. I'm sure you ought to be very much obliged to your Aunt Bertram and me for contriving to let you go. A pretty good day's amusement you have had. And actually, Fanny's had a really frustrating...
one of the worst days of her...
worst days. But Mrs. Norris is so focused on, she's got her cream cheese and her heather and her, you know, pheasant's eggs.
How blind she is to everything going on around her. And it kind of feels how useless she is as a chaperone, because effectively she's there as the older woman to kind of steward young people, and she does none of that. She's busy just getting what she can out of the experience.
And you know, she's an acquisitive, selfish, self-centered, but totally deluded person. You know, she believes in her own niceness. So but there's an even extreme example in Sense and Sensibility, isn't there?
Yes, I was trying to think which example you were talking about. The comic character that I wanted to talk about from Sense and Sensibility was Robert Ferrers, and I was thinking that's not the one I was going to say. And yes, but he's a great comic character in terms of his truth cases and things like that. But yes, revealing true selves and revealing particularly negative aspects of true selves the classic scene at the start of Sense and Sensibility where Fanny Dashwood just completely manipulates her husband out of giving his sisters what he's planning to do, like £1,000 each, which would have given them, you know, a significant addition to their present income and their future prospects in terms of marriage. And it plays out over sort of like two to three pages. And she just talks him down again and again in a very clever, manipulative way. And it's really funny, but it's also really dark because the huge impact that we know as readers it will have on them to not have this sort of financial stability. And it tells us from the very start who Fanny Dashwood is and how negative her influence is likely to be over the course of the book for her sister-in-laws. Yes, that's a favorite example. And I mean, that scene is such a classic scene. It's a good example for almost, and I think we used it in Manipulative Mothers as well.
Yes, I think we did. But and as you say, there's something about there's often a scene in which you're kind of introduced to a character, and that's how you kind of get an idea of them. And the George Ferrers intro is brilliant, isn't it?
Robert Ferrers, yes. Because he's introduced as a kind of like somebody else in a shop, and you don't know that he's going to be a character. He's just a really like pompous, self-interested young man who's dismissing all of the different toothpick cases because none of them is quite right for him. And this kind of this show off, this preening, pompous foppery, is all encapsulated in this tiny scene. And then it turns out that he's actually Edward Ferrers' brother, quite a close family member who then is trying to use his influence and thinks that he has the knowledge and the intelligence to use his influence to sort of dictate who Edward Ferrers should marry or how his family should be handling certain situations. And there's one of my favourite takedowns in the whole of Jane Austen, which isn't actually spoken aloud, is when Eleanor is talking to Robert Ferrers, and he is talking about cottages, and he knows that they live in a cottage, and his conception of a cottage, because he comes from this very, very wealthy background, he's never really had to work or anything or do anything in his life. His conception of a cottage is really like a mansion with another name. And he's telling Eleanor how the cottages are very spacious and comfortable and not any problem. And Eleanor's just like, Eleanor agreed with it all, but she didn't think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. Fantastic. Yes. Arguing with him because he's such an idiot.
Oh, Mansfield Park has its share of idiots, as well as very clever, very witty people like the Crawfords. And my favorite of those is Yeats. And again, he introduces the idea of doing a play into the book, which is a very sort of pivotal sort of bit of the plot again. But he's moans and moans about how he was involved in all these theatricals, is planning these theatricals at another house, Lord Ravenshaw's house, and then and they were just like, it was all nearly ready to, the production was they rehearsed everything, and then Lord Ravenshaw's grandmother had the audacity to die and ruin things. And he says, oh, it's not worth complaining about, but to be sure, the poor old dowager could not have died at a worse time. And it's impossible to help wishing that the news could have been suppressed for just the 3 days we wanted, so they could do their play. It was but 3 days, and being only a grandmother and all happening 200 miles off, I think there would have been no great harm.
Yes, and it shows the kind of the shallowness of his character and the lack of respect, I suppose.
I mean, it's an outrageous thing to suggest, and he completely thinks it's quite reasonable. But it also then, as ever, tells you something about Thomas Bertram. Tom Bertram, that he's, he thinks Yates is the bee's knees, you know, and that
That he's
tells you a
associating
lot.
with this person and respecting this person. Yeah.
Respects this person, and you know, so yeah, as ever, it's never just a bit of fun.
And it also foreshadows the return of Sir Thomas Bertram,
Yes.
which likewise just defeats Yates in his purpose.
Yeah. Indeed.
Speaking of outrageous things to say, I did want to mention one from Emma,
Yes.
which is, again, it's revealing, and it's very funny. I think it's one of the funniest takedowns in all of Austen, but it's also very, very inappropriate. And that is the scene on Box Hill, where Emma is, well, Frank Churchill is trying to encourage people to chat, and he's trying people to tell Emma one very witty thing, two quite clever things, or three things very dull indeed. And then Miss Bates saying, oh, very well, then I need to be an easy three things very dull indeed. That will do for me, you know. Sure to say three dull things as soon as I open my mouth, shan't I? And Emma immediately responds, "Ah, ma'am, but there may be a difficulty. Pardon me, but you will be limited as to number, only three at once." And it's brilliant, because all through the book we've been like struggling with these long speeches of Miss Bates, and we do sometimes get a bit fed up with her as a
We
as
do
a
get irritated. Yes.
And Emma is so right, but at the same time so nasty. Like, you can't say that. It's a very cruel and unkind thing to say, and it kind of reveals to us how Emma's been led astray by Frank Churchill, and how she's lost some of her kind of like caring and considerate attitude that we see earlier in the book, where she's arranging sort of card parties and things for her father.
Yeah.
And it gives us that opening for seeing that she needs a turning point, and it does become a bit of a turning point for her character, that she realizes that she shouldn't have said that out loud, but it doesn't stop it from being
funny.
Really funny. Yeah, it's like she says what everyone's thinking, but she shouldn't have said it.
And it's yes, there are characters where we can just relish their awfulness, like Lady Catherine de Bourgh's the obvious example, or you know, or Mr. Collins, in fact, you know, in Pride and Prejudice. But there are others where, yes, the humour comes with discomfort, because they're putting their foot in it, or you know, I'm conscious we've been talking quite a long time, and we could talk forever about
and we should probably wind up. But I think
we should probably wind up.
Want to talk a little bit at the end about persuasion.
Yes, but I did just once, because I think persuasion is generally seen as the well, I suppose the most solemn, the least funny of Jane Austen's novels now, but
I have to disagree. Like, it's the least funny in situations, it's got the least sort of witty dialogue, but really it's where the cynical humor really comes to the fore, and it's like Austen gets the knives out. You know, there's been social commentary in every single book, but now it's like she's really skewering the things that she's seeing that she disagrees with and she disapproves. And it starts so brilliantly.
You get it right from the start, don't you? Yes. The first lines of chapter 1. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour and consolation in a distressed one. And you know, it's like
the vanity immediately that's brought to the floor, that we know that we're getting to undermine over the course of the book. Yeah, it's fantastic.
And if you've ever read, you know, like looked at a copy of, like, you know, Burke's Peerage, or those sort of books, you know, it isn't a book, it's just like a list. It's a list of you know, births and deaths and how many children people have.
There's nothing entertaining about it.
Nothing entertaining. So yeah, it tells you everything about him, really. And it's one of those. She's so good at brilliant starts, isn't she? Yeah.
And a lot of the humor in Persuasion comes from the narrator, and the kind of like the bitterness of the narrator, but bitterness that is translated into these kind of slightly sarcastic comments. One of those does get turned into conversation instead, and I did want to mention this. It's Anne Elliot talking to her cousin Mr. Elliot, And she says, my idea of good company, Mr. Elliot, company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal of conversation. That is what I call good company. You are mistaken, he said gently. That is not good company. That is best. Good company requires only birth, education, and manners. And with regard to education, it is not very nice. Nice in the sense of meaning sort of particular or fussy, like, as long as they're
Doesn't
kind
really
of
matter.
polite and well born, it's all
That'll
good.
do.
That kind of like summary of what living in Bath is like.
Yeah, what the values were of most of society, but not Anne Elliot's vows and values, and are by implication we know what Austen thought in the way she portrays that.
And we see the cleverness of how she presents Mr. Elliot, because we see that he's clever enough to identify these kind of social problems, and yet he's still happy to go along with them. He's poking fun at them, but he doesn't have any impulse to change that or to live differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's our kind of a little celebration of Austen's humour. There's a million other things we could have said, and if you read her letters, you realise that actually she really tones down her humour in the novels. She's much sort of almost she's really brutal in the letters. You see that in her
sometimes even about people dying, or
absolutely. So yes, like Yeats. But yes, and it's always lovely to get comments, and do put, dear viewer, your favorite lines and favorite scenes in the comments, and then we can all enjoy
laughing over them. What I would just mention is, I wanted to, if I'd had time, to read bits of it, because I know that the stories that she wrote when she was younger, things like Lady Catherine, and the history of England, all of those are really, really, really funny. And Lady Susan as well is kind of like a great blend of dark humor, social commentary, and maybe a bit more honesty because of the epistolary form. There's just too much to cover.
There's too much, really. There's too much to say about how funny Austen is. So well, maybe we can next year we can do another different selection and and enjoy the rest of Jane Austen July and everything you're reading.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Well, that was great fun.